Right. Welcome to Norris Clarke's The One and the Many, Chapter 8, Self-Identity and Change, Substance and Accident. And tonight, Samuel Watkinson will be providing the summary, and then we'll launch into the discussion. So take it away, Sam.
Okay. So this, in the previous chapter on change in general, Norris Clarke referred in passing to a distinction between two types of change: accidental and substantial or essential. But he has not yet established philosophically whether there is such a thing as accidental or substantial change. Thus, in this chapter, we must begin doing just that. Then we must search for a solution to the problems that they raise. We are compelled to undergo this procedure because many philosophers, whether from east or west, while admitting that human experiences that give rise to these distinct classifications, deny the basic Aristotelian explanations of them in terms of metaphysical compositions of substance, accident, and matter and form, and so do not accept the description of them as accidental and substantial. This chapter will largely focus on the first type, accidental change, and then the next will focus on substantial change. So in the first section of this chapter, Clarke begins with the problem, which is a common way he begins chapters. He sort of just asks questions. And so the two quote-unquote problems here, which are not really problems in the strict sense, but perhaps in the technical sense of problemata in Greek and in Latin. The first is it the case that there are beings that preserve their self-identity intact through a series of changes? And especially, is this the case in humans? If this is the case, the second problem, then how can we explain that this is possible, intelligible, in terms of the inner metaphysical structure of such a being? So here we meet the one and the many problem again, this time reappearing not by comparison with other beings, but by comparison of changing phases within the same being. After this, he somewhat, in a disconnected fashion, I think, talks about rival philosophical views. This is kind of a segue section, which I think doesn't segue that well, but from the previous section. But at any rate, so the three main rival, quote-unquote, rival philosophical views of this section is, in some way, David Hume and his empiricism. He's known for, what's often called the bundle theory of self, where we are nothing but a bundle of different physical and psychological states. The second is Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy. So for Whitehead, there's no actual entity that remains unchanging, but only a series of successive entities that we call one being, because the series is closely connected by a chain of what he calls inheritance of properties, one from the other. Thus, what we call the human self is merely a succession of selves bound together by a common chain of inheritances, for instance, memory. This theory seems to be inspired by the modern scientific theory of the ultimate constitution of material things by a multitude of atomic particles, a theory which is then projected into a universal metaphysical explanation of all reality. And then the third rival philosophical view is Buddhism. Well, at least according to his characterization of Buddhism, nothing has its own being, but all are connected within this web of called dependent origination. And he acknowledges that there are differences between, Mahayana idea of nirvana, what it means to attain nirvana, and also Theravada, but ultimately he's just, trying to characterize Buddhism in broad terms to provide a foil, for what he thinks to be the correct or most compelling explanation, which is a variant of the Aristotelian Thomistic account of change, right? So that's really in a nutshell, the second section. And the third section is the solution to this problem, which he raises in the first section. That's why I said that the second section is kind of doesn't suit segue that well, because it's sort of first to third, I think, is how it most appropriately transitions. Anyway, so this is subtitled "The I as Synthesis of Permanence and Process." So there's 3 steps for demonstrating the truth of the Aristotelian understanding of self-identity and change. So like, the first is that there must be some principle of self-identity through change in each human person. Otherwise, we cannot explain these facts of our experience. So there's 4 facts of our experience, which he thinks need to be accounted for in any theory. So the first is memory. The second is moral responsibility for our past actions. The third is promises and pledging of fidelity for the future. And the fourth is our experience of carrying through a project toward a goal. So 2 of them are kind of past oriented, memory and moral responsibility, and then the other 2 are more future oriented, promises and carrying a project toward a goal. The second step is that this principle of self-identity cannot be identical with the various phases of changes it goes through. There has to be some kind of real metaphysical composition with these changing phases. The third step is we must name these metaphysical co-principles. So substance, which comes from the Latin substare, to stand under. So that's that which stands under all its phases. And accidents, which is from the Latin accidere or accidere, depending on how you want to pronounce the Latin there. It just means that which falls to or happens to, literally, to something, but doesn't change its essential self-identity. It's also important to note here that accident is a technical scholastic terminus. It doesn't carry the usual connotations of, that we think of something we accidentally did some action or whatever, without thinking. And it's also important to note that to not fall into a common misinterpretation of substance as something static, inert, or unchanging. So, in short, self-identical does not equal unchanging. So, therefore, substance is supposed to be seen as a dynamic notion. And he quotes a bit of Aquinas to demonstrate this from the Summa Theologia and the Summa Considered Gentiles, which says, respectively, quote, every substance exists for the sake of its operations, and, quote, each and everything shows forth that it exists for the sake of its operations. Indeed, operation is the ultimate perfection of each thing. Thus, the notion of self-identity isn't self-enclosed, but open and flexible, as long as, however, it's within the limits of its nature, which is a point he also made in the previous chapter on change in general. There has to be limits within the nature, while there's potencies to change. Right, a certain bit. yeah, so he concludes that third section by just saying, we have discovered above the first role of substance, which is the principle of perduring self-identity through accidental or non-essential change. So that's synonymous. So accidental means an accidental change is a non-essential change, in other words. The second role of substance, which he briefly adumbrates in the fourth section, is to function as the unifying center of the many different attributes and properties possessed by one being at any one time. So their proper mode is not to exist in itself or in se in Latin, but to inhere in another, or in alio in Latin. In other words, inheres in the substance, which does not, the substance does stand in itself, but never without some kind of modifying accident. Yeah, so this is quite important to emphasize, is to never divorce a being or substance existing in itself from various modifying accidents, right? The substance has this kind of quote unquote static role, and he puts, quotes here on static, which is to unify them in the here and now, not across time diachronically. It's all about looking at how some substance is at a certain time, and to certain time and place, right? So that's the fourth section, really. The fifth section is titled Metaphysical Definition of Substance Accident. So just a brief kind of definition of these terms which he's been talking about so far. So he says that a substance is that which is apt to exist in itself and not in another. That is not as a part of any other being. Whereas an accident is that which is apt to exist not in itself, but only in another. A corollary of this is that wherever there is being, there must be substance at its core. For if everything existed only in another, there would be an endless regress with no ultimate foundation, and nothing could ever exist at all. To be is either to be a substance or to exist in a substance. However, it may be possible for an uncomposed, unchanging being, that is God, to exist by itself as a substance with no accidents. On the other hand, it is not possible for an accident to exist by itself, but only in another. Right, that's what I sort of just said before. Yeah, so that's the fifth section. And the sixth section is titled Extension of the Substance Accident Structure to Other Levels of Being. And hold a second, I just sort of lost my, oh, here we are. So yeah, in this section, he has 4 steps again. So in general, he says, wherever there's a case of real identity and being through change, there must be a substance accident structure, right? Otherwise, there would be, the being would be unintelligible. Secondly, in animals, so, going sort of from down the chain of being, so to speak. So in animals, especially in the higher ones, like us, right? There's clearly manifested something similar to our own self-identity. There's evidence of memory, for instance, in animals, right? Thirdly, in plants, in the process of growth, adaptation, etc., there's some kind of self-identity, but they lack the integration and interiority of others, sort of less intense than in animals who are higher, right? And so the distinction of each organism as a unity becomes blurred, more blurred. Fourthly, an inanimate being, in other words, below the level of life, there appears to be something like distinct units of action, tense of being, because when you break them up, their properties change. For instance, oxygen and hydrogen combined into molecules of water extinguish fires, but when we break them up, they are highly flammable, respectively. But it's not always easy for us to distinguish genuine unities from aggregates. And these units are so integrated with and dependent on systems of particles. So the levels of reality exhibit an analogous spectrum of self-identity, from weaker to stronger as we go from higher to lower levels of being. So those are kind of the four levels of being he talks about. And then he next asks, how is substance known? Not by sensory impressions alone or empirical evidence, but by reflective insight into the meaning of a whole series of experiences in the life of someone, by analogy with our life, right? Because we're the most familiar being to reflect on things. So in other words, beware of Hume's misleading model of knowing as taking a direct look at something and ignoring the dimension of the knower, right? And so looking at both the knower and the known, subject and the object, in the act of knowing something. So that's the fifth section. The sixth section is the seventh section. That was a sixth section. Is just three objections that he sees to this way of thinking. So he thinks most of these objections just rely on a misunderstanding of the classical notion of substance as kind of static, right? So that the first one is this notion of Descartes' idea of an isolated self-enclosed substance. He says, quote, substance is that which needs nothing else but itself to exist. It is that which exists by itself, whereas the classical notion was that which exists in itself. So yeah, as we were saying a bit earlier, there is a slight distinction, even if they between existing in itself and by itself, even if in Latin the words can be used synonymously. Like to say that, for instance, that a being exists in se, INSE, or per se, those terms can mean either in or by itself, but in certain context, there is a real distinction to be made between that which exists by itself and that which exists in itself. Yeah. And the second objection is John Locke's inert, static, unknowable substance. It is underlying substratum that's needed to support the properties and accidents of a thing. But it itself is purely inert, static, not self-revealing by its action. And this is, he thinks, the main reason why most philosophers reject substance. And for good reasons, because it's a kind of a straw man, right? Because substance by its very nature is oriented towards self-expressive action. The last thing it is static. The third objection he looks at is the separable substance of Hume and empiricism. Hold a second, I've sort of accidentally deleted my, or closed my tab, just hold a second. Yeah, so the Hume's notion of substance is that is of a substance that's so distinct from its accidental properties that it's kind of separable from it, right? And this is a real danger I see in a lot of interpretations of Aquinas in general. Is like or scholastic or even classical philosophy in general. It's so easy to fall into this trap of making a distinction into a separation, in many different fields. And I think that's partly why, as a slight tangent, like we have someone like Duns Scotus with this formal distinction, which is supposed to be a middle way between a real distinction and a conceptual distinction, because perhaps it's a way to clarify that we don't want to we don't want to separate while distinguishing in some way. Right, so that's the seventh section on just 3 objections, sort of 3 stock modern objections that he goes through. And then in this appendix of sorts, he just goes through the various categories of being that we find in Aristotle. So we have substance, or ousia in Greek, and then 9 accidents, which are, as he articulates, quantity, quality, action, passion, or being acted upon, relation, time, place, posture of the body, like standing or sitting, and then lastly, clothing worn, like wearing a hat or brown pants or whatever. So he sees the first 6 of these categories to be irreducible, and the last 4 can be reduced to the other ones. He adds to these 10 categories, though, another category which he sees to be a variation of an accident, an accidental category, right? Which is he calls system. And so a system, the way he defines a system is it's a set of relations which form a new unified order or togetherness, like a being together or a Mitsein in German. And this kind of also, by the way, fits with the the etymology of system itself, which comes from the Greek. It's composed of sun histemi. Sun means with or together, and then histemi means to stand. So sort of to stand together. That's what a system is. That which stands set set together, in a sense. And so the importance of this notion of system is that substantiality and relationality are 2 notions that are primordially important. So in other words, to be for us, as much as for other beings, is to be together. That's the relation between substantiality and relationality. This varies though. So like in some systems, the system as a whole dominates the individual so strongly that their individuality becomes submerged. So for instance, the ants in an ant colony or the bees in a beehive. So in these cases, the system dominates them so much that they could almost said to be compose one being. And he says, almost said to compose one being. So they're not quite. And I'm also reminded of like another example is often used, is like, in politics is the analogy of a body, like Hobbes is a Leviathan of the a state as a body politique, right? It's another notion of a system which can arguably said to collapse into a kind of totalitarianism, right? And ultimately, to conclude, Clarke thinks that we need to, in human social systems, maintain a certain balance between individuality and an individual service to the whole, in order to avoid this potentially totalitarian state. Okay, yeah, so that's the summary.
Thank you, Samuel. Well done. And
No problem.
right, well, there's a lot to reflect on there. So I think we'll just open it up to questions, discussion, anything that came up from that. You know, if there are any points that people need clarifying or observations with regard to the substance or the accidents of that presentation, please go right ahead.
Okay, so I might as well start, I guess. Just some comments, really. I don't have any questions, but thank you, Samuel. That was really useful. For me, I got the impression, I mean, and I suppose this is true of Aristotelian metaphysics in general, it sort of makes a lot of sense, and even it's almost kind of in some ways almost obvious, right, or common sense, and yet I wasn't really had problems really just being convinced by it at the same time. Like it's very plausible, like the metaphysics, but like with step one, no, so section 3, yeah, step 1 is where like he outlines the arguments for, so I guess this is almost the most important part of the argument or the development of the argument. And I just didn't find the reasons he gives for a principle of self-identity convincing. It just seems like this could be how it is, but there doesn't seem to be any really convincing proof or like a logical, a watertight argument. Like the most interesting one for me was memory, and his suggestion that memory, you can't make sense of our experience of memory without positing this principle of self-identity. But I think you can actually. Anyhow, I won't go into the weeds because that'll be boring perhaps. But I don't. But it made me think anyhow. Memory is a fascinating one, and it's one I hadn't thought about before. It is it is on the face of it, it does seem like a good reason, but I don't think it is when you really think about it. Or at least there's a rival hypothesis you can present or explain memory in terms of a kind of a succession of states of, or continuity or continuum of selves without a principle or a substance that underlies everything. I think that's possible. And the other ones are, I think, more sort of obviously specious because they can be, they're not really, again, very sort of obvious and intuitive though at the same, so quite compelling in a way because he's got a point when he says, sorry, I won't go on for too long, but when he says that there's a bit where he says, if you have to take into account things like moral responsibility, promises and pledges, fidelity and all that stuff, because otherwise, if you say these things are ultimately just illusions, which is, I think, say maybe some sort of Buddhist would say they are kind of an illusion. That doesn't mean they're unimportant or that, you know, we can do without them, but I think you can say they're illusions. But anyway, my point, he was saying that any theory that says that is just suppressing the data of experience rather than explaining the data of experience. And I'm not sure that's good enough, actually. And there are some other things. I mean, it's just, all in all, very, very interesting and argument. I don't know if everyone was convinced by it. I'm not, but I found it very interesting.
I mean, I would just be curious, even though you just said yourself you're may not be interested in going into the weeds. So I'd be curious, nevertheless, as to why you were not convinced, particularly. Like, what are some of the reasons for not being convinced by the first step?
Well, he says, so I remember past events, scenes, things, etc., not just as past, but as mine, as my past experiences of these events, which I recall as having happened to the same me that is remembering them and talking about them now. But that's just there's no argument there, that's just an assumption. I don't remember, so when I remember myself as a 10-year-old, why does he assume that I am remembering the same me? He just says that I'm remembering the same me that is remembering them now. So so hang on, which
I think you're misunderstanding what he's saying, Naeem. Because I mean, just the fact that you just said.
No, just a sec. And maybe I misquoted, but just a sec. So he says.
Because you said I'm the same me. His point is just to briefly say, his point is just that there's some subject, which is you, which transcends all the changes of the subject. That's all his point is.
Yeah,
I don't
but
think you disagree with that.
Yeah, but that's I mean, you can make that point, but
like that's just the notion of the unity of consciousness. I
mean, no. Well, yes, because yeah, I do disagree. So, but if I could explain why I disagree, we've got time.
Sure,
You asked the question, so because you asked the question, right? So you have to give the chance to reply. Unless, can I carry on?
Absolutely, yeah. No, just
okay. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says. So let me just quote it. It's very brief paragraph, so just bear with me. Okay, so he says, I remember past events, scenes, things, etc., not just as past, but as mine, as my past experiences to these events, that's begging the question, etc., which I recall as having happened to the same me that is remembering them and talking about them now. But I don't. Why does he say that? I don't remember. I mean, you can say that, but that's a bold assertion. There's no argument. Now you can say that, and it's plausible. Like I said, it's plausible, but it's just one hypothesis. There are alternative hypotheses that explain the same data, which is or the same phenomenon, which is memory. Like I don't have you can do it. You can, if you can, I won't draw a diagram again because it's complicated, but you can think of a succession of cells which have, and if each sort of, so if you think of a succession of cells where the successor of each is very similar to the previous one, then and they're all on a continuum, and if each one or not everyone, because not all states are remembered or exist in memory, but if each one has some set of states which are associated with some set of states in the future, then that's what all that memory is, right? It's more complicated than that because we actually remember not just points in time in the past, but also durations. So it gets quite complicated. But that's why I didn't want to get into this, because you can actually develop a theory which doesn't assume substance, as in a thing that is handed down through time, perdures through time. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I won't go into it anymore because it's quite tricky, and I'd have to draw a diagram.
By the way, if you don't mind me asking, when you think of succession, do you think of it as linear, or as in following a straight line, or circular in the sense that one circle succeeds? No, I'm just wondering.
No, I don't think. I mean, that would be super complicated. I think if you keep it simple and think of just temporal or linear temporal succession, I think that's normally how we think of time and going through time, right? Except that there doesn't have to be anything going through time. There could just be states, right? I mean, I know this is not something that people like to think about, that they don't really exist as anything, except as, phenomenal, transient things that only abide for. But it's a plausible hypothesis, and there's nothing in this argument, I think, that logically compels you to accept this Aristotelian Thomistic idea of how memory works, rather than, say, a Buddhistic hypothesis where you don't assume an abiding self at all, or a substantial self. Anyway, over to you.
I have to admit, I don't really see any intrinsic conflict between what he's arguing and a Buddhist. Like, I think the conflict that he makes, I mean, Brian can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think his characterization of Buddhism is unnecessarily antagonist, like in conflict or opposed to his account. I don't think Buddhists will deny that there's some subject that may, to which various things occur. I think the notion of an anatman, no self, or whatever, I think that's often misinterpreted by Western people. I don't think it means what he thinks it means. Would you agree, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think, definitely it gets somewhat short shrift in these pages. I mean, I'll just note, by the way, there's a typo there. When he talks about own being, it should say svabhava, not svabha. It's just missing the word self. So, but
actually, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The interpretation of anatta in the West, which gets interpreted as no self, actually, some people have correctly said that it's actually not self. That is what it really is supposed to mean, which really does change things, because if you're saying that the Buddha was trying to say that there were 5 aggregates that we were not, and these 5 aggregates were sense impressions, thoughts, volition, sensations. I'm probably missing one there, but there was something that remained, in a sense, beyond that. And I think in that sense, I agree with you, Samuel. I don't think it necessarily, I don't think what Clarke is bringing in completely contradicts Buddhist philosophy. And again, we're making generalizations here because there are many different schools out there, but I do think that there is some continuity with the individual. I've studied Buddhism for several years and did several retreats with Tibetan lamas. And I can tell you, some of these people who were highly realized people who maybe had some established stability and whatever you want to call it, awakening, enlightenment, nirvana, they still acted very much like individuals that were informed by their past and also directed by some sense of purpose in their future. And I think that there is something that coheres the individual even beyond the egoic limits of oneself. You can transcend the ego, but it doesn't mean you stop being an individual. So the contractions that the ego dictates in us, the inclinations that we might have towards certain desires or certain aversions, may not necessarily have the same grab once we transcend that. but we still live in the world in a particular way. We don't necessarily just become anybody. We become more fully ourselves, I would say, in that way. And what that aspect of who we are more fully ourselves is really less dictated by these what would be the accidental, I guess, in Clarke's language, and would be more substantial in the way that we would be guided. Also, Aladistor MacIntyre, who wrote the book, well-known book After Virtue, he talks about looking at one's life as a story or a narrative. And I think that's a really helpful analogy, because it allows us to think about how our lives are dictated by certain memory sense impressions that cultivated our character, but also we're always kind of being guided by a sense of purpose and what we're meant to be. So that whole arc of a life creates this sort of narrative that really becomes a unifying, coherent center as what it really means to be a person. And I think that ties a little bit to, I think, what Clarke's trying to distill in this whole notion of the substantial and the accidental.
I mean, on the whole, I mean, it's very brief. I mean, I think what he does say is reasonably on, it's not, was there any particular point, Samuel, that you thought maybe was a bit simplistic, or just? I think it makes sense.
It's just the impression that he created, like, by putting it as in juxtaposition to his own view. That was the main issue that I had. Like, where he, like, I don't think, so when, I'm gonna give you an example. So like when he says in the spiritual path alignment, give up the illusion of a distinct, that is separate self or ego. I don't think Clarke disagrees with that. His theory, I mean, his view says, like, just down, if you go down, he talks about how, to be is to be together. So there's no separate selves, So I don't know why he's trying to, he's just unnecessarily disagreeing with that Buddhist notion of there's no separate egos. I mean, yeah, so that's my issue, really.
I guess it boils down to is, what do we mean by there's no separate egos? Because the term separate is relative, in the sense that there are degrees of separation. Like,
right, that's the point I was trying to make earlier about how it's important to not make distinction into separation. It's so easy to do that, to misunderstand someone who's doing that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's very much the way that, you recall when I said that he said, oh, well, Advaita Vedanta is not a participatory metaphysics, which is kind of, you see me laughing because I go, no, of course it is. But so he kind of unnecessarily, like he needs to create in a, to kind of say, well, we're not going quite for that, and we're not going for that, but this is the,
He needs to divide in order to conquer. Or in Catholic language, he needs to make distinctions in order to show how he needs to make distinctions in order to separate his philosophy from other pagan, non-Christian philosophies.
Now, on the other hand, I mean, I think it's good that he's bringing in non-Western philosophies at all is a good thing, right? I mean, that is kind of, at least somehow bring them into the conversation. But it is curious, as you say, right, that given his stress on this kind of interdependent being, really, I think, the way that the account of being that he wishes to give is a kind of, in some ways, intriguingly consonant with the Buddhist perspective. I mean, the legitimate contrast is, right, that Buddhism is not a doesn't present a metaphysics of substance, right? which, you know,
Development part. The two truths.
uh,
Oh, sorry.
no, and as you say, right, I mean, it's crucial, right, anatta is really, you can interpret it as no self or as not the self. But so what you're really saying is, right, in the aggregates, there is no self there, right? That which, you know, in the mind, there is no self. In the body, there is no self. In, you know, sense impressions, there's no self. In, you know, my energy, there's no self in that. But he's not saying there's no self. I mean, that's kind of a matter of some contention.
Wait,
There's
but
one-
that could be interpreted as the self is not reducible to mind. The self is not reducible to thoughts. Basically,
Exactly, yeah.
he's not saying that the self doesn't exist. He's saying that the self can't be reduced into
So
any.
who's saying what? Are you talking about the Buddha? Who's not
No,
saying?
it's just an interpretation of the Buddha.
Right. And,
No, I
and
mean, are we talking about Norris Clarke, or are we talking about who didn't say? I lost the thread. Is not saying that the self is not reducible to any of the aggregate? I suppose it's a Buddha, right?
No, that's my interpretation. That's what I'm.
well, I'm saying,
Yeah.
and I'm saying that is a legitimate interpretation of, you know, the Buddha's teachings, right?
Yeah.
Is that essentially when you've completed this, you know, these negations, what is it that remains? And Buddhist tradition usually doesn't tell you, right? There's no,
Yeah.
but then that's when you get into the debate about, you know, what does enlightenment really mean, right? What is it? What is nirvana? What is, you know, what does it mean to be a Buddha? And Theravada Buddhism sticks much more to the, you know, apophatic, just, you know, it just declines to say, essentially. It will only talk about the cessation of suffering, and I mean, you know, and it is in the transcendence of the human condition, you know, kind of, where Mahayana gets more into the positive dimensions of Buddhahood, right? It's illumination, right? I mean, actually, to be fair, there's some of this, right, inchoate within Theravada, but there's much more elaboration of Buddha qualities, right? You know, which we would think of as maybe divine qualities that.
Yeah.
But the Buddha expresses, you know, like omniscience and
Yeah.
kind of, you know, all manner of perfections, right? So the perfections, right? You know, the same kind of things that a saint, right, who's walking the path of, you know, sanctification, theosis, right, would kind of begin to exhibit these kind of saintly qualities, right?
Yeah.
And so you get much more of that in Buddhism. So, and each Buddha is kind of, you know, a distinct personality, right? I mean, while on the one hand, you know, all Buddhas are one, right? Particularly, we used to talk of the wisdom mind of the Buddhas as one. But, you know, why is there, you know, Padmasambhava and Tara and
Shakyamuni.
Maitreya, and, you know,
Yep.
clearly there is this is why I always have a problem when people say there's no doctrine of personhood in Buddhism. I just went, you know what?
And then you bring in the notion of reincarnation to it, that it really makes it interesting, right?
Yeah.
It does. And there is a point, right? It's not, there's not like a sense of a soul, right, going
Yeah.
into new bodies. It is true. It's more like a kind of a mind stream, right? Kind of like these impressions, right? Almost the way that a wave crashing gives rise to another wave, right?
Yeah.
You know, kind of your subtle impressions from your karma create another kind of bundle or cluster of experience, which then is a sentient being. So
Yeah.
Buddhahood is basically the removal of the accreted sentient beinghood obscuring the face of Buddhahood, right? And now this is more the kind of Mahayana, particularly, you know, like in the Tibetan framing, which is like informed by Chittamatra or Yogacara, which is to say the mind-only perspective, but then later developed in various ways. It's like you have this intrinsic Buddha nature, which is revealed once kind of the accumulated karma is cleared away. And
yeah.
It's like Plotinus's philosophy, right?
I think you could draw some very comparing parallels. So in a sense, you could say that, right, for those schools of Buddhism, our true self is Buddha nature, right? Is Buddhahood.
Yeah.
And the most controversial thing, right, is that there are actually certain Buddhist scriptures in which they say, that Buddha nature is endowed with the perfections of selfhood and permanence, and like all the things that it's like no, you don't say that. That sounds like Atman. That's that other thing. No, but those scriptures exist, and so so you would have to nuance the picture, but.
No, that's definitely true. I agree with pretty much everything. I mean, as far as I know, or I've studied Buddhism, there is like Mahayana Buddhism, the Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism in particular, that I studied for a little bit. You're completely right. There is this idea, and there's this sort of tension between the idea of Buddha nature and on the one hand, and emptiness or
but what if you're speaking analogically, though?
Sorry?
All the contradictory things they're saying about self and not self, nothing, something.
Yeah.
What if they're all analogical predicates?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, of course, all of these metaphysical systems, they're expressed in language, and the language has limits. There are limits to how adequate any linguistic, verbal formulation of ineffable truth can be. So, they're bound to. But there is, I readily admit, there are like strong, even within Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, as Brian pointed out, there are like this idea of Buddha nature, which looks very much like some sort of idea of like an essential. They tend not to use the word self at all, as far as I know. I could be wrong, but my experience with Buddhism is that they really avoid. They take great pains to avoid using words like self, and certainly words like self. I've asked Kempos and about this, and they always, this is their problem with the idea of God as well. They think that God is just like a big, of course their idea of the Western theistic notion of God is not very nuanced, and that's all true. So that's all true. I just wanted to pick up on something you said, Brian, about Advaita Vedanta, and in relation to what Norris Clarke seems to be developing here, and the sort of Thomistic point of view. I think it's much easier to actually find a reconciliation, right? Because but we're talking about different tendencies. With this kind of philosophy or Aristotelianism, there is a strong tendency toward positing like a multiplicity of substances, and even though they're said to be in some sense all connected, interdependent or whatever, like there is a strong you get a strong sense of the human person like is like an irreducible whole, like an entity, which is like you get at the bottom of our experience is like a human substance or a soul. And that's, I think the Advaitin point of view would be like to say, no, there's just one self in the end, and we are all like all this multiplicity of different. I'm bastardizing Advaita Vedanta, but you can't. The ultimate is never this multiplicity of selves, or human selves. That's all just ultimately it's illusory and it's provisional, right? So, I mean, it's a question of where the emphasis is, I think. You can try and marry the two perspectives, but they are different perspectives nonetheless. To some extent.
It seems to me that the an Advaitin wouldn't disagree necessarily with the Buddhist presentation of phenomenal reality, right? But then they would say that this is an appearance, right? I mean, they wouldn't deny that kind of the individual self or jiva is kind of constituted through these different factors, but it's all within Maya, and what remains is Atman. And Buddhism won't say this except in a very kind of particular perspective known as other emptiness or extrinsic emptiness, which is quite controversial. But generally, yes, and I think that the point is that that which we really are is so ineffable that anything we can say would mislead us. So using that positive language is going to misconstrue and condition us. I mean, a lot of it comes down to really the difference between Buddhism and I mean, saying Hinduism is just way far too, but certain Hindu schools, right, how they understand language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Buddhism is nominalist and it's always suspicious of language. Whereas, at Vedanta and certain other schools of, Hindu tradition are more realist, and they believe that when the word has a real relation to the thing, Advaita Vedanta is like the one. They're more circumspect in the use of language, partially through kind of the absorption of the Buddhist dialectic and certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy. I mean, that's why people would initially accuse the Advaitins of being crypto-Buddhists, because they were, less straightforwardly realist in their use of language. So I mean, that's a whole debate whether the elusive self of Advaita, which is very clearly not the selfhood of like any kind of naive realist self. That's not the self of Advaita. Whether that's the same as Buddha nature, you won't get. The Advaitins would say yes, the Buddhists would say no, but they have to say no because but to bring it back right to the chapter, right, what would Clarke say selfhood is, or what would the Thomistic tradition?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Well, I mean, so this is where I'm wondering the same thing. And as much as I would like to go down this very nice route where everything can be reconciled, I just keep coming. I mean, like, I feel like no, I mean, he maybe I've got it wrong, but he does. It seems for Norris Clarke that he's always talking about how this, the human person. I don't know if he uses the word person, but he does. I mean, he does talk about our stories and our make us who we are, and we have our, personhood or dignity as human beings, and we have to stop there. Otherwise, if you question that, if you question the irreducibility of the human person or the human self, all hell is let loose, right? Nihilism, because outgo values and moral responsibility and all that stuff. And I just feel maybe I'm wrong, but there's a very strong sense in this that no, it doesn't really go that extra mile and sort of say, really everything is just one and there are no. It doesn't. It stops at separate selves or egos, and it's sort of like, yeah, maybe I'm wrong about it. I hope I'm wrong about that.
Well, and I wasn't asserting that he necessarily agreed with these perspectives, but certainly, as you say, right, he wants a more robust picture of the self as including, and personhood is irreducible, right? As a personalist, right? Which not all Thomists are personalists, but he certainly is one.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, slightly more general point, I think I'm okay with like saying that there are different philosophies that contradict each other that still, reflect truth in some way, even if they contradict, because like, we're talking about the limitations of language and so on, and, different philosophical systems. And I don't think it's problematic for me if it does. Personally, I think Thomism can embody, truth. I don't think it has to be the only Christian way of approaching truth. I mean, I'm struck by it's very specific, it has very specific architecture, and I don't think that this is the only Christian way of apprehending truth, let alone all truth. So this is, I'm sure you guys, not to say that you just said anything to disagree with that. I just think we should be comfortable with saying that, this contradicts. What's wrong with saying Buddhism contradicts Thomism? I don't have a problem with that.
Wait, that reminds me, but there are multiple, there are many different interpretations of the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas too. So
yeah. And Buddhism, there are many different kinds of Buddhism as well, and it's a mess. It's all of it. It's yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if that's a strength of Thomas Aquinas's philosophy, that it's prone to many different interpretations, like the Bible is. I wonder if that's a strength, or is it a weak? Well, that we can't pin down Thomas Aquinas's philosophy to just what the historical Thomas thought. No, it has to include all these different interpretations. I think that's a good thing, but anywho.
I always go back to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that no system can be complete and coherent. It has to be one or the other. And I think that's true. So like if you do want to create a system that is inclusive to all concepts, then you're going to lose some coherency in the process.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm just reminded of like Heidegger's, he makes this distinction between Wissenschaft and Denken, or so science, scholarship and thinking. He says that, to think amidst the sciences means to go past them without despising them. So I think this is why, for instance, if you see his characterizations of like some pre-Socratic philosopher like Parmenides or whatever, it's very much influenced by his Germanic heritage, and it's not really, it bears a very remote relation to actually what Parmenides said, or for instance, directly. And I think, this can be done in legitimate and illegitimate ways. But I think in general, like the principle I get from that is just that, like, even if Norris Clarke is, and by saying that self-identity does not equal unchanging, he's trying to emphasize, in other words, dynamic notion of substance, even if that's a bit of a stretch of what Aristotle says, which I suspect it is a little bit of a stretch of both what Aristotle and also what Aquinas, modifies Aristotle to be. even if that's the case, which I'm not persuaded necessarily is, but that's not necessarily, unfaithful to Thomas or Aristotle. Like it might be a way to think with them. And the other point I just want to make with regard to what Naeem was saying about why can't we acknowledge certain systems contradict each other? Sure, I guess on the face, I don't mind acknowledging that, two people might have, different perceptions of the system, the respective systems, which do on the face of things contradict each other. I have no issue with acknowledging that, but I would also want to say at the same time that, the law of non-contradiction is relative. You can, it has kind of relative application. So like this is just like what often happens in our experience. We see two statements which seem like a pair of contradictory ones, which turn out to be under some hitherto unimagined condition to not actually be contradictory. And this is why you have in analytic philosophy, you have Graham Priest with his paraconsistent logic, and how contradictory statements can be not a violation of reason, but a kind of a going beyond, So yeah, I don't know. That's just what my thoughts are on what Naeem said, and also just
No, I concede that, and that you're right, because in general, I think it is a more fruitful way of thinking about different points of view to try and find a reconciliation, or to try and see beyond the any sort of binary. No, that's a fair point. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, does the principle of non-contradiction only applies to things that are univocal in meaning, or do they apply also to analogical or equivocal too? Because it seems like the principle of non-contradictions works when
No, I think it's only a univocal. If the same word has different sense, and when you're applying it to that, it has to be in the same sense, univocal. As far as I know, or I'm aware.
I'd say it depends on which type of analogy you're thinking of, because there's two in scholastic philosophy, rooted in Aquinas, but this particular distinction you don't find in Aquinas like directly, but there's a distinction between analogy of attribution and analogy of proportionality. You might have heard of. You see this distinction in later scholastics, right? And one of those, the proportionality emphasizes the dissimilarity or discontinuity between two sets of terms.
Yes.
Right. Whereas the other one emphasizes the similarity. And I think it depends really. So like if you want to, in the analogy, emphasize some dissimilarity or discontinuity, then then you could say that the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply in this particular case, but you don't, but you don't want to say that absolutely. You don't want to say, it doesn't, the law of non-contradiction doesn't apply absolutely. You want to say that's only if you want to emphasize the kind of dissimilarity. But if you don't want to collapse into equivocity and make it, lose the thread of connection, in other words, then and emphasize some similarity between two terms, or two ideas, whatever dissimilarity there is, then then you could say that the law of non-contradiction does apply in this particular case. So it depends, really.
Yes.
That's quite interesting. I never thought of that, how analogy comes into it. So I suppose I'm trying to think of an example. And so if I say something like, I see that 2 + 2 is equal to 4. And so that can be true in a certain sense of C and false in a certain sense of C, where the two tenses of C are different, right? So but there is an analogy between seeing something visually and seeing something mentally. So it actually does complicate you could say they're both true, or so you could say one is true and the other is. Yeah, it's interesting. Is that what you're getting at? Because in the same sense, and if you're not considering analogy, then it's only a lot of contradictions only applies to univocal terms, as far as I understand. What
This
is
is why, to just add one thing, is I often see like when people like make commonplace analogies with some situation or whatever, and then someone critiques them and says, oh, but look at all these dissimilarities, and then the person's like, but what I was trying to emphasize was the similarities in the analogy. You see this happen so many different times, so it really does depend, like, why are you making the analogy? What's the purpose? Are you trying to emphasize similarity, dissimilarity, or are you trying to emphasize a bit of both? So that's the point I was just trying to make. Like, you need to ask the person, why are they trying to make the analogy? What is the purpose of it? Is it to emphasize some different sense of being or different ontology? So like, for instance, we're trying to, with theology and philosophy, we're trying to acknowledge that God's being, if he has been, that is, I sound too apathetic, but that God's being is somehow discontinuous from or indifferent to our, or quechly finite being, right? And that, but yeah, we don't want. It depends. Like for someone like Clarke, like he still wants to think of God as a being. We are a being, God is a being, but God is just the maximum ends, even if he's also like being itself, as they often say, right? With, for me, someone more apathetically Platonist inclined, like I would, I wouldn't mind saying that, denying that God is a being among other beings, that he's, as Pseudo Dionysius says, he's super essential being, being beyond being, really.
Yes.
Which for Clarke might sound contradictory. Well, he thinks, as he said a bit earlier when he was critiquing Neoplatonism, he following like, well, at least on this point, he's following the critique of Etienne Gilson, and of someone like Plotinus, this notion of, and seeing this notion of God as beyond being, or huper ousios, and seeing that as incoherent. But I think he's wrong. Like Gilson, he's just, his interpretation of Plotinus and other Neoplatonists after him, like Dionysius, is just wrong there. But yeah,
It's
so
sorry.
depends. But yeah,
it's sort of analogous to saying God is not an efficient cause, he is a super efficient cause. It gets weird, like, oh my gosh. Not only that, consider, like, how there are some cases that are purely equivocal, like the bark of a tree and the bark of a dog. Does that make sense? They're considered equivocal, purely equivocal terms. I don't think they're equivocal, though.
Well, they're semantically equivocal, but
yes, denotation wise, but connotation wise, there's some similarity between them, because the bark of a dog sounds rough, while the bark of,
yeah,
it gets weird because, okay, denotation wise, they're different, they're way different, but connotation wise, there might be an analogy between the two.
Well, I was going to complicate that even further by pointing to the etymology of bark, which I think is I think it's an Old English Germanic word. I'll have to check that up, but or it might have some cognate with a Latin word, to break. To the bark, it might have some to link with to break something. But at any rate, like what I was trying to complicate there in asking about the etymology was that oh gosh, what was it you were saying, Lorenzo, just before?
Oh, denotation, which is
Oh
the
yeah,
definition.
yeah. So what I was going to say was that that the denotation or the etymological denotation here could be similar in the case of a bark. You know, the word bark, you know, could come from the same root, in other words.
Yes.
But connotatively and in context, you know, the usage of the word, it could be different. You know,
Yes.
bark. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. So yeah, there are definitely multiple layers of like different similarity and difference depending on what you're looking at there.
One other thing that's, well, so Samuel, I mean, do you think that even if you would say that ultimately God's right can't be encompassed only by, you know, being, right? Would you say that nevertheless we can validly indicate him by referring to him as being, you know, or as, you know, the plenitude or, you know, existence, quite, you know, big E existence? Like, is that true, even if it's not, like, how I mean, isn't that, I mean, we have to see where Clarke will ultimately go. He hasn't brought God into it yet, or the, you know, the first principle. He hasn't really talked about that yet. So I don't know exactly how he's gonna, I mean, he doesn't want to embrace a fully Neoplatonic perspective, but I mean, he does probably appreciate it more than certain earlier Thomists would have. Even though, I mean, I would agree that probably we would want to understand, you know, ipsum esse in the as meaning the same as beyond being, rather than dismissing that as a contrary position. I also wonder what Clarke would say to the claim that God is, you know, the coincidence of opposites, right? So really then the principle of non-contradiction holds up until you reach God, at which point, you know, it all bets are off. You know, he's both the maximum and the minimum, right?
Not only that, but for him, a cat is both dead and alive at the same time. Technically, since he transcends time, I mean, a cat's dead and well, yeah. Does that make sense? For him, the cat would be both dead and alive at the same time.
Yes, for God, we are all dead and alive. Not even saying simultaneously isn't even right? Because it's not like he's in a moment of conventional time, and in that conventional moment of time, he's experiencing every conventional moment of time. It's that all the possibilities are already encompassed with, yeah. And in fact, I don't even think that they have to be occurring. They don't have to be present to him in some way for him to know them. Like, he doesn't have to have an experience of, say, me as a baby, or, you know, you when you were 10 years old to know that. It doesn't have to be rehearsed in some way. I don't think that we would have to say that, you know, and that's where I have to think, you know, like, you almost wonder whether it's even appropriate to speak of a divine mind, right? Because it's clearly, you know, it's well beyond the ken of mind as we conventionally, you know, like, that's why I'd be very wary of any kind of attempt to psychologize the Godhead. But
yeah, that's why Plotinus specifically uses the word hypernoesis or hypernoetic to describe the one. You know, it's not against nous, but it's higher than nous. So it's kind of like, you know, Heidegger's notion of Aufhebung, or like a sublation or lifting up into a higher state, or realm, or whatever you want to think of it. It's not a negation of nous in a simple sense of a negation, but an uplifting. Or if it is a negation, it's not a negation that is other to nous, but it's a fulfillment of an enlargement of nous, what nous is like, right? It's kind of so that's very specific language. That's why I use very specific language, so as to not think of the one as, you know, as most people think of the Plotinus as one as, you know, sort of mindless, unintelligible, unfeeling kind of.
No,
First
when we
principle.
mean that, we mean beyond that. Not like he lacks, you know. We mean he's beyond mind, because mind is finite. He's beyond feeling, because you get what I mean, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like most people just don't see that the Latin prefix trans, or the you know, or the Greek hupert or hyper, it kind of it's, or even if we like say that something is, we use the alpha privative in Greek, so like we say that something is the equivalent of impassable in Greek is apatheia, which is a negation of pathos.
Mm-hmm.
And pathos is a limiting notion, like it's sort of
Wait,
or pathy, sorry, to use the plural word properly. And to apatheia is a transcendence of, or a being in control of pathos, or at least the way that's the way that the notion is applied to humans, like in someone like Clement of Alexandria. But yeah, so
in saying that God's not mind, isn't another way of saying is God is infinite mind, because infinite is sort of, well, a negation.
Yeah, that sorry. I hope I'm
Like
not
in saying he's not being, we're basically saying he's infinite being in a certain, well, in a weird sense.
Yeah, on the question of whether God is mind or not, I think that's a bit like any other thing you'd like to say that God is. You have to say that, of course, when we say God is, if we say God is mind, then of course we're not talking about any sort of finite mind or a limited mind or a human mind. So I mean, I think that goes without saying, right? So God, if we are, but then it's just a question of definition almost. If we think of mind as being limited, or if we can only imagine human minds, then of course God isn't a mind in any sense. But I actually find the concept or the idea of mind very useful for understanding what God is as an approach, even if God in himself or in itself is infinite and ineffable and inscrutable. Nonetheless, mind is a very useful way of understanding or getting or approaching God as you know, that ineffable thing, whatever that is.
It's
right.
Like Wittgenstein's ladder. You know, once you're done with the ladder, once you've reached the purpose, you discard it.
Yeah, and also simply because mind is, like, to me, it just seems like almost the most general thing you can think of, because everything that you're aware of is in your mind. In, you know, just because you're aware of it, it's already in mind. And I don't want to digress too much, but this actually something that I've been thinking about a lot, and even just recently reading about Platonism, and I'm still trying to figure out when maybe you guys who are steeped in Platonism could answer this, but very often when let's say the Platonic forms are interpreted, and, you know, and realism is expounded, the forms are always they're not. It typically realism is explained as the view that forms are not either they're real, so they're not. It's not nominalism, but they're not in mind either, which is usually called conceptualism. But they're a sort of like in Edward Fesser uses the term third realm, and he sort of finally poo-poos that and says, he prefers Aristotelianism as a good Thomist.
Wait a minute.
Forms are in the things themselves, like that's how he talks about, which is I know. I'm sorry for mentioning Fesser. I know everyone hates Fesser.
No. I was gonna say Fesser
because he's
too.
just. I hate him too. He's just a right.
Not everyone.
Just an idiot, but also
Certain
very
people like
effective
Fraser,
and very good
unfortunately. But
Catholic philosopher as well.
I don't.
think.
I think he has as a limited perspective. He's all. Look, I think he's all right. I mean, but as far as he goes, I mean, he's not the most interesting
No,
philosopher. But I think he's good at
Yeah.
what he does. He's
Yeah.
like it's there. So I don't
exactly.
think, like
No.
you can overstate just how much you dislike his persona or his
No,
or something,
no, what I mean to say is that no, I don't think Fraser charitably reconciled Plato's view. Yes, there is
Oh
a
no,
realm.
yeah,
It's
I
God.
agree. He has this. He's very, like I think David Bentley Hart said somewhere, like he's very good at writing, philosophy for dummies, but in a really good way. That's a slight, and it's very disparaging. But he's actually quite good at like summarizing and sort of not dumbing things down, but actually summarizing and simplifying some systems of thought and ideas. So if you want a quick synopsis of Aristotelian metaphysics, because you're lazy and you don't have the time to read Gilson or whoever, you read Fraser, and it's he's not that bad, I think. Anyway, my question was, the question was, so he says, forms are in this third realm, but I always find that problematic. For me, realism in that sense is really unpalatable, because it's just like this thing that's somewhere which is you have no experience of, and it's completely different from mind. So I always try and I don't know if it's possible, but I try and comprehend Platonism or through an idealist sort of framework or lens, but I don't know if that's plausible or viable. But to me, that's the only way that it could make sense at all. But mind then would be not like a human mind. Obviously, it would be mind as such, or the universe, or reality, whatever you want to, or God. Yeah. Is that something anyone has any thoughts on?
Yeah, you could say God's the unwalled world, the Platonic universe, or something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be so vague. It's just that, like, the Platonic, to me, the Platonic heaven, or the third realm, or whatever you want to call it, is really vague. That's the thing which is it's just completely superfluous, and you don't need that. Not mind as such. Mind is like obvious and self-evident. It's just there in everything you experience. And you can, whether you call that God or not depends on how you think of, like your finite ego and your relationship to the universe and such, But is that not Platonism? And Plato wouldn't dig that, I guess. What? That's a question.
You can be assured that most contemporary analytic characterizations of Platonism, including phases, are an absolute bastardization of both what Plato actually probably believed and also what a lot of Platonists historically believed. I say this because it's just obvious once you read someone like Fraser's characterization of Platonism as a foil for, his Aristotelian Thomism, that he's getting his characterization of Platonism from Thomas's tendentious characterization of Plato's perspective,
Yeah.
which which Thomas himself inherits from Aristotle, who in turn has a tendentious interpretation of his teacher,
Yup.
right? In order to, self-servingly present his perspective as better. I mean, you just need to be aware of all of this, train of reception and in the way someone's.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Well,
Fraser is a
some
bad
sort of
example
distorted.
in a way. Because there are lots of much more respectable, and careful, rigorous academic philosophers. And they think of Plato as positing as some sort of Platonic heaven sounds ridiculous, but something like that, like an abstract realm, the realm of abstract entities. And I just find that weird. I mean, it kind of makes sense in a way, but it's sort of like it's a bit of I don't really. It's a bit incredible.
I mean, to be fair, there's some places like the Parmenides dialogue, which seem to suggest that he thinks of the forms as some kind of separate realm. But even then, if you look in context, when he speaks of by the way, forms, I hate that translation of the Greek. I think that's at least one of the problems. The word in Greek, eidos or idoi, I think it's better translated as idea or ideas. I think that's the less misleading translation, because forms, the Latin form of the Greek word, it tends to hypostasize, in other words, present it as if it's some external realm divorced from the subject, which is not, and that's the opposite of what Plato believes about the forms, or the ideas rather. For Plato, what is real are the looks. Ide, that's what eidos comes from. It means like that which is seen, or by us, right? The looks that sensible things display to the mind present what is real in a sense, but the ideas are really real, because they are altogether intelligible. So as compared to if we think of sensible instances of something, which are kind of often presented as multiple appearances of some unitary idea. So some take a species and in a genus, like a dog. A certain dog is a part of a certain dog instantiates the genus, or the idea of doghood, but there's no. This is Aristotle's view, but I also think Plato's view in a different way is that you can't have an abstract idea without instantiation into certain forms. I know most people interpret Plato as believing just that, that there's some, you can have ideas or forms, without concrete instantiations of them. But yeah, that's a contested interpretation of Plato's dialogues, which are polyvalent, they can be interpreted in different ways. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to get into this topic, but it's, because it is a really, Plato scholars, they don't. Well, increasingly in my study, they haven't really they've begun to question this idea of Aristotle's conception of Plato's idea or doctrine of the forms. Like Plato never speaks of like a doctrine or like a dogma, some static kind of teaching or whatever that relates to the forms. Or he always presents the idoi or the ideas of the forms, whatever you want to call it. He presents it always in the mouth of someone else, the interlocutor who's speaking to. It's never him, Socrates usually, or it's never the main person. So that itself, I think, should warn people to, extrapolate what is Plato's system of idea of the forms or whatever. So yeah.
Plato basically is a tinkerer with different ideas, huh? I mean, he loves to play with different ideas. Well, oh no, never mind.
I also just want to, it seems like, particularly if you're looking at, I think we already said, in a way it's an in-house disagreement, if Aquinas talks about, the Platonists, but it's really on behalf of a perspective that's, quite Platonist in its own way.
Yes.
Of course. And for that matter, not to, Fazer favorably cites, wait, so what was the name? Who wrote Aristotle and other Platonists? Lloyd Gerson, yeah, he cites Gerson quite favorably, particularly, in defining this Platonism, right? Which would also apply to Aristotle just as much as it would, to Plato, right? Fazer did this whole blog post, join the Platonist Alliance, right? Which, it sounds pretty good to me, right? He's saying that there is a coherent perspective. It's not just entertaining. Really, Gerson is saying this. It's like if you read the Platonic dialogues, what are the constants, right? Like, what can we say for sure about Plato's perspective? We can say that Plato is an anti-materialist, anti-mechanist, anti-nominalist, anti-relativist, and anti-skeptic. And then together, right, you could say that on the whole, Plato is an anti-naturalist, right? And so in that sense, it would, right. So it's interesting then that it sounds like elsewhere Fazer has maybe, strawmanned Plato on certain points, but there's a degree to which he's kind of, speaking on behalf of a perspective that is similar in many ways, and that kind of vis-a-vis kind of modernist perspectives, or sort of, I think is similarly positioned, at least in broad terms. Maybe in particular points, one might wish to kind of. There's another thing that we said quite some time back that I think is very, very interesting too, which is kind of, right, Clarke wanting to posit a dynamism. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Lorenzo. See you next time. Glad you could make it. We were talking about Clarke wanting to posit a dynamism in substance, yes? I really don't understand this, really with any degree of precision or nuance, but the philosopher Mullasadra speaks about what he calls substantial motion, which is to say that he would say, yes, substances are not fixed. And he says that this has to be the case when you have a metaphysics of existence, right? That maintains the primacy of existence rather than the primacy of essences, right? So the essences or substances have to be dynamic, and we don't notice it because it's in a scale that exceeds are like, for us, they seem quite permanent, right? But in a scope beyond that of, the finite human experience and lifespan, the substances actually exhibit a dynamism. There's a nothing is static, right? Everything is in motion. So there's a gradual transformation in the very inner structure of things, and I think this idea is one that a lot of philosophers have found very intriguing, and so I wonder whether certain existential Thomists, right, would want to move towards a similar perspective. My sense would be yes, and I don't know. I don't know exactly how Sadra articulates this flux, this state of flux that all substances are in, but it's certainly something I'd like to explore more. To what degree that agrees with the what Clarke is driving at. But.
There's a whole chapter, I think, in that book by Christian Jambert and Mullasadra, which I have, on substantial motion, which I haven't read yet, but once I do that, I'll definitely let you know what he says about that notion of substantial motion.
Definitely, if you find any juicy excerpts, please do share them with the group, and I think that would be very interesting to put in dialogue with Clarke.
But my suspicion would be that Mullasadra might disagree with the Aristotelian framework, but not necessarily a Thomistic one. So, like, if Thomas slightly modified Aristotle's idea of motion, and then, or at least there's some seeds of modification and evolution which provides, which Norris Clarke sees and appropriates, draws out, then perhaps the issue would be with Aristotle's framework of, like, the types of change, which I think he has two main types of change. You have, like, instantaneous, the move from potentiality to actuality, and then kind of a gradual type of change, which is characteristically expressed in terms of generation and corruption. That kind of, he wrote a work called on generation and corruption, I think. So, yeah. So maybe, Thomas goes. I don't think I haven't read much of that, much of Aquinas, aside from the Summas and a bit of some other excerpts, but yes, I'd have to determine exactly where he might modify Aristotle's account of types of change, but my suspicion would be he doesn't do it that much, like himself. He seems to, on the whole, to be to agree with Aristotle's natural philosophy and its framework. So
yeah, I think I'm very interested in these kind of shifts towards a post-Aristotelian view. I mean, certainly, right, a view of the cosmos as infinite rather than finite, right? may necessitate certain moves beyond a perspective that was formulated within the Ptolemaic universe, right? Certainly there are reasons why we might wish to reframe the Aristotelian picture of change, while keeping intact many of the elements of his synthesis of his perspective that are still sound and but no, good. Are there any other things that we wanted to be sure to touch on, from the chapter? Was there anything that stood out to you as
I was struck by, I hadn't I must have seen it somewhere, but I didn't know that one of Aristotle's categories was wearing clothes. That was like a fundamental type of predication of any substance, which is, I mean, to his credit, Norris Clarke also says, this can't be explained in terms of relations, I think he says. But that was oh, my internet connection is unstable apparently, so I don't know if you can hear me. But yeah, that was interesting. I mean, that's just not very important, but I found the categories quite interesting. Or I mean, most of them actually make sense in terms of when we think about predication, and I guess that's a more important point, that when he talks about when Norris Clarke talks about, so there's a section that says something like the definition of, or the metaphysical definition or something about of substance and accident, and then he says that they should be understood in terms of these linguistic categories of the subject of predication, which is the substance, and predicates, which are the accidents. And that was interesting. I mean, that I'm not saying, I assume that's not what doesn't just boil down to how we use language, but language reflects how, the nature of things, I guess, is what Aristotle and the Thomists would want to say. But that was interesting as well, that this mirroring of the nature of things and substance and accidents and how we use language. But yeah, but wearing a hat, I mean, what does that have to do with anything? That was...
Well, I can help with that. So like, that's just the usual example that's given by Aristotle. So like to the putting like a shoe in or like one's arms or whatever on, like the Latin word that's used, he didn't put here, would be more helpful, is habitus, which comes from the verb habere, means to have something. That's the category which underlies that particular example. The equivalent in Greek is ekin, or it just literally means to have something, yeah, so that's what he should have said that, rather than the example of the clothes, putting on clothes, which is more of a specific example rather than the actual category itself.
Right. But I think doesn't he say, he says the category is wearing clothes. Maybe that's wrong, I don't know. And then he says the examples he gives are wearing a hat, etc., etc., which is interesting. And maybe in the Greek language, I don't know. So you seem to be saying, maybe I misunderstood, but this wearing clothes is a very basic type of predication. But if that's the case, for Aristotle to make that really fundamental in his,
in his metaphysics, that's interesting because it leads you to think that he was misled by the way his language works, because surely that's not, and Norris Clarke also thinks that that can't be a fundamental, just type of a type of accident that substances undergo. That's just, it seems weird.
I just
Yeah,
want to mention, I
There you
think
go.
the last,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The last section of the chapter where he gets into the systems and talking about how systems don't necessarily have substance like the individual. I think that could obviously lead to an interesting conversation around political implications, because obviously he makes the point that any system that gives emphasis around the individual should be a priority. So obviously he, not necessarily takes a strong stand, but I think he takes a stand around the idea of liberal democracy versus Marxist socialistic kind of governments where the individual could be undermined. And I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, definitely. He does get into this sort of at the end of the chapter, just a little bit about kind of a system that you would characterize as totalitarian would submerge the individual for the good of the whole. Whereas, of course, you can see the opposite excess in overstressing individualism, which is why, it makes a lot of sense, right, that then you would want to envisage a political system that would be participatory in some sense. And I don't know to what degree Clarke deals with things like, atomistic, analysis of politics and society, and whereas if I recall correctly, right, like the best, I think the best pure governmental form is monarchy, but in reality, right, in the real world, it's preferable to live in a mixed system, right? You want to have a mixture of kind of democratic and aristocratic elements, if I recall correctly. You want to kind of, and I'm not sure if it's because I think it might be because human beings are, because of how we are. We're not angels, right? We're not. You have to limit. You have to disperse kind of evil, and I think that might be one how you come to kind of a need for more pluralism within the system. But I would definitely like to, it's a topic I'd definitely like to learn more about and think through. Well, I can see that the session is starting to wind down, so I'll go ahead and say thank you for joining us, everyone, and I'll go ahead and end the recording. If you want to hang around for a bit, that's all right, but if you need to go, that's perfectly fine. And so I think we've had a great discussion on chapter 8, and I look forward to discussing next time chapter 9, essential or substantial change, form and matter 2, which so that sounds very apropos what we were talking about there at the end. So